My husband's mistress showed up at my house, thinking I was the maid, so I played along, uncovering my husband's massive debts, filed for divorce, and took control of my assets. I stood there holding her designer coat while she walked into my house like she owned it. Blonde, maybe 25, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's rent. She looked around our foyer and said, "This place needs updating. I will talk to Richard about it." Richard is... My husband was my husband, the man I built this house with brick by brick, working 2 jobs while he finished medical school. The man who apparently had a mistress, young enough to be his daughter, who thought she could redecorate my home. "Where is Richard?" she asked, not even looking at me. "He is not here," I said. "Well, when will he be back? I do not have all day." "Who are you?" I asked, even though I was starting to piece it together. "I am Alexis, Richard's girlfriend." "And you are the help, apparently." She laughed. "Well, yes, obviously, though, but Richard usually has better-dressed staff. Are you new staff?" In my own home, wearing my regular Saturday clothes, jeans, and a college sweatshirt, I apparently looked like the help to this child. "I have been here 12 years, I said. 12 years? Richard has only lived here for 5. Try 12. She rolled her eyes. "The help always exaggerates their tenure. Just tell Richard I am here. I will be in the living room." She walked into my living room, sat on my couch, put her feet up on my coffee table. The coffee table Richard and I bought at an estate sale our first year of marriage. We finished it together in the garage. "Could you bring me some water?" she called out. "With lemon, not too much ice." I brought her water. "No lemon, too much ice." She sighed like I had personally offended her. "Is Richard training you?" "This is not how he likes things done." "How does Richard like things done?" "Properly, efficiently, with respect for his guests." "Are you a frequent guest?" "I am here every Tuesday and Thursday when his wife is at work, sometimes Saturdays if she is at her book club." "I do not have a book club. Haven't worked Tuesdays or Thursdays in 2 months since I changed my schedule." Richard did not know about the change. "You seem to know a lot about his wife," I said. She laughed. "I know enough. Older. Let herself go. Boring. Richard is only with her for the convenience. Cheaper to keep her than divorce her. He says that all the time. She trapped him young before he knew better. Now he is stuck with some frumpy woman who probably does not even know what Botox is." I touched my face unconsciously. 37 years old. Some lines, sure, but frumpy. "Richard deserves better," she continued. "Someone young, beautiful, who understands his needs, not some housewife who probably thinks missionary is adventurous." "Maybe she works," I suggested. "Oh, please. Richard says she has some little job at a company. Probably a receptionist or something. Nothing important." "My little job running the company I founded 8 years ago. The one with 200 employees. The one that pays for this house, Richard's car, his practice that has been hemorrhaging money for 3 years." "Richard's practice must do well," I said. She snorted. "Between us, it is struggling. But that is what happens when you are too nice. He needs a woman who can push him to be ruthless. That wife of his probably encourages his soft side. Maybe she pays the bills while he figures things out with her little salary. Please, Richard is the man. He provides." I went to the kitchen, pulled out my phone. Richard was at his golf club. Saturday routine never changed. I texted him to come home immediately. Emergency with the house. He texted back that he was in the middle of a game. I texted that the ceiling in his office had collapsed. He would be home in 15 minutes. I went back to Alexis. "Richard is on his way. Finally, I have been waiting to surprise him. We are going to Cabo next week. I booked the villa and everything." "Cabo's nice, expensive. Richard is paying. Obviously, he always pays. That is what real men do." "How long have you two been together?" 6 months. Best 6 months of my life. He buys me everything I want, takes me to the best restaurants. Did you know he spent $8,000 on my birthday necklace? I did know because I saw the credit card statement from our joint account that I fill with my little salary. That is generous. I said he is very generous with the right woman. His wife probably gets grocery store flowers and dinner at chain restaurants. Probably. Richard's car pulled up. He walked in looking panicked about his office ceiling. Saw Alexis first. His face went white. Then he saw me, went whiter. "Richard," Alexis jumped up. "Surprise, I came to see you." "Alexis, what are you doing here?" "Visiting you, silly. Your help let me in, though she is not very good. You might want to replace her." My help. He looked at me. I smiled. I kept my smile steady while watching Richard's face shift through at least 5 different expressions in about 3 seconds. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something, then closed again when nothing came out. He looked at Alexis, then back at me, then at Alexis again, and I could actually see his brain working overtime trying to figure out which lie might save him. His hand came up to loosen his tie even though it was not tight, and he took this weird half-step backward, like his body wanted to run but his legs would not cooperate. Alexis was still standing there with this big smile on her face, completely missing the panic radiating off Richard, like heat waves off asphalt in summer. She started to move toward him for a hug or something, but then she caught his expression and stopped mid-step. Her smile faltered just a little bit and she glanced over at me with this confused look, like she was trying to figure out why Richard was not happy to see her. I watched her eyes move down to my left hand, where my wedding ring sat, the same ring Richard put on my finger 12 years ago when we got married in that little courthouse ceremony, because we were too broke for anything bigger. The ring caught the light from the window, and I saw Alexa stare at it for a solid 3 seconds before her brain started making connections. She looked back at Richard, then at me again, and her face went through this slow-motion realization that would have been funny if it was not happening in my living room. Richard finally found his voice, and it came out all scratchy and weird. He said I was his business manager, that I handled the house finances and helped with paperwork, and he was talking really fast, like speed would make the lie more believable. Alexis looked relieved for maybe 3 seconds, her shoulders relaxing and that confident smile starting to come back. I held up my left hand so the ring was right in her line of sight and said very clearly that I was his wife of 12 years, the one she had been talking about for the past 20 minutes, while I brought her water with too much ice. The color drained out of Alexis's face so fast I thought she might actually pass out right there on my hardwood floors. Her eyes went huge and her mouth opened into this perfect O shape, and she literally stumbled backward until she hit the door frame between the foyer and living room. She grabbed onto the frame with one hand to keep from falling, and her designer purse slid off her shoulder and hit the floor with this expensive-sounding thunk that echoed in the sudden silence. I could see her trying to process what I just said, her eyes darting between my face and my ring and Richard's guilty expression. Her breathing got faster and her free hand came up to her throat like she could not get enough air. Richard started to move toward her, but I held up my hand and told them both to sit down in the living room because we were going to have a conversation like adults. My voice came out calm and steady, even though my heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my ears. Richard opened his mouth to argue, probably to say this was not a good time, or we should talk privately, or some other excuse, but something in my face made him shut up immediately. He walked over to the couch and sat down on the edge, like he might need to run at any second. Alexis followed him like she was in a trance, moving slow and careful, like the floor might open up and swallow her. She sat on the opposite end of the couch from Richard, as far away as she could get, while still being on the same piece of furniture. I stayed standing because sitting felt like giving up some kind of advantage I did not want to lose. I looked at Alexis and told her to tell me everything about her relationship with Richard, and she immediately turned to look at him like he could give her permission or tell her what to say. Richard was staring down at his hands in his lap, picking at his thumbnail the way he does when he is nervous. Alexis's mouth opened and closed a few times before any sound came out, and when she finally started talking, her voice was shaky and small. She said they had been together for 6 months, that they met at some hospital fundraiser where Richard was trying to drum up referrals for his practice. She said Richard told her he was unhappily married to someone who did not understand him, who was boring and old and did not appreciate what a good man he was. Her voice got even quieter when she said that last part, like she was starting to realize how stupid it sounded now. Richard tried to interrupt with some apology or excuse, his head coming up and his mouth opening, but I cut him off before he could get a word out. I asked Alexis about the money, about all the things Richard bought her, and I kept my voice steady and calm like I was asking about the weather. Alexis listed everything in this small, scared voice that was nothing like the confident tone she had used when she thought I was the help. She talked about dinners at restaurants I had never even heard of, places downtown with names in French or Italian that probably cost more per meal than most people spend on groceries in a week. She mentioned the $8,000 necklace for her birthday shopping trips, where Richard bought her shoes and purses and clothes, weekend trips to beach resorts. It is a few hours away. Then she said the Cabo trip, she had booked a villa that cost $12,000 for the week, and Richard had told her not to worry about the cost because he wanted to treat her right. Her voice cracked on that last part, and I saw tears starting to form in her eyes. I pulled out my phone and opened our banking app. Pulling up the credit card statements I had been looking at for the past month, trying to figure out where all our money was going. I held the phone out so they could both see the screen, and I scrolled through the charges, highlighting each one with my finger. Dinner at some place called Leonard Dan, $470. Jewelry purchase at Tiffany, $8,200. Hotel room at the Ritz, $600 for one night. Alexis went pale again as she watched me scroll through charge after charge, and I could see her doing math in her head, adding up all the money Richard had spent on her over 6 months. She turned to Richard and asked if this was true, if he had really been spending his wife's money on her. And her voice cracked hard on the last word, like it was physically painful to say. Richard tried to explain that it was complicated, that his practice had been having some rough years and he was going to pay it all back once things turned around. I interrupted him before he could finish and said his practice had lost money for 3 straight years running, that I had been covering the losses out of my salary while he pretended to be some successful doctor who could afford a mistress. Alexis's hand came up to her mouth and she made this small sound like she might be sick. I told her that I had been covering Richard's practice losses, his car payment, this mortgage. Basically everything in our lives while he was playing sugar daddy with my income. I said every gift he gave her, every dinner, every hotel room, every single thing came from money I earned at my company, the little job she had made fun of earlier. Alexis looked like she might actually throw up right there on my couch. And honestly, I did not blame her, because her whole fantasy about Richard being this generous, successful man who could take care of her had just shattered into a million pieces. Richard was still staring at his hands, and I noticed his face had gone red. Not from embarrassment, but from anger, like he was mad that I was telling Alexis the truth about our finances. Alexis started crying for real now. Not pretty tears, but ugly sobs that made her mascara run down her face in black streaks. Alexis wiped at her face with the back of her hand and smeared black makeup across her cheek. She looked at Richard and then at me. And something seemed to click in her brain, because she suddenly sat up straighter on the couch. She asked Richard about her father and said he promised to help with her dad's career advancement. Richard's face got even redder, and he shifted in his chair but did not say anything. I asked what her father's name was, and Alexis said Knox Mercado without looking at me. My stomach dropped hard because I knew exactly who Knox Mercado was. He worked in my company's operations department and had been there for 4 years, doing decent work, but nothing that stood out as special or promotion-worthy. I turned to Richard and asked if he really promised to influence Knox's career at my company. Richard stared at the floor, and his silence told me everything I needed to know. He had been making promises about my company to his mistress without even talking to me about it. Alexis started crying harder now, and these were not the delicate tears from before, but real ugly sobs that made her whole body shake. She called Richard pathetic and asked how much of what he told her was actually true. Richard just sat there looking at his hands like they might have answers written on them. I stood up and told Alexis she needed to leave my house right now. She did not argue like I expected, but just grabbed her designer purse off the coffee table and picked up her coat from where I had left it on the chair. She walked to the front door, and I followed her to make sure she actually left. Alexis paused with her hand on the doorknob and turned back to look at me. She said she was sorry and that she did not know I was real. It was such a strange thing to say that I almost laughed, because of course I was real. She opened the door and walked out to her car, and I watched her drive away before I closed the door and locked it. When I turned around, Richard was standing right there trying to reach for my arm. I stepped back fast and told him not to come near me. He started talking really fast about how the affair meant nothing, and how he loved me, and how he would end it completely so we could work through this together. His words ran together like he thought if he talked fast enough, I might believe him. I held up my hand to stop him and asked how long he had been lying to me about everything. Not just about Alexis, but about the practice and the money and those Tuesdays and Thursdays. Richard's face changed and he looked down at the floor again. He admitted the practice had been struggling longer than 3 years. He said it was more like 5 years, and he did not know how to tell me. 5 years of lying about his business while spending my money to keep it afloat. Richard said he felt emasculated by my success and that everyone in our social circle knew his wife was the breadwinner while he was the failed doctor. I reminded him that I worked 2 jobs to put him through medical school. I built my company from nothing while supporting his dream of becoming a doctor. This was how he repaid me for 12 years of supporting him. Richard tried to interrupt, but I kept talking over him. I told him to pack a bag and leave tonight. He could stay at a hotel or with a friend, but he needed to be gone within 1 hour. Richard said it was his house too, and he had a right to stay here. I reminded him my name was the only one on the deed because my money paid for every single brick in this house. He opened his mouth and closed it and opened it again, but no words came out. I pointed at the stairs and told him to start packing. Richard walked upstairs, and I heard his footsteps on the floor above me. I went to the kitchen and pulled out a bottle of wine from the rack. I poured myself a large glass and sat at the kitchen table trying to process that my 12-year marriage just fell apart in my living room. The house was quiet except for Richard moving around upstairs, opening drawers and closet doors. I wondered how I missed all the signs, or if I just did not want to see them, because seeing them would mean admitting my marriage was a lie. I heard Richard's footsteps coming down the stairs, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway with a suitcase in his hand. He sat it down and tried one more time to apologize. He said he would do anything to fix this and make it right. I took a drink of my wine and told him the only thing he could do right now was leave and give me space to think. I said we would talk through lawyers from now on and he should not contact me directly. Richard picked up his suitcase and walked to the front door. I heard it open and close, and then his car started in the driveway. The engine sound faded as he drove away, and I sat alone in my kitchen with my wine. The glass felt heavy in my hand, and I set it down on the table because my fingers were shaking. The house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the corner and the clock ticking on the wall. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes just staring at nothing before the tears started. Not the pretty crying you see in movies, but the ugly kind where your face gets red and your nose runs and you cannot catch your breath. I cried for every lie Richard told me over 12 years. I cried for working 2 jobs while he went to medical school and thinking we were building something together. I cried for every time I covered his practice losses and believed him when he said things would get better. I cried for being so stupid that I did not see what was happening in my own house on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The worst part was knowing he stayed with me because leaving would cost him money, not because he loved me or even liked me. I was just convenient. A bank account with a heartbeat. I sat at that kitchen table until almost midnight, crying and drinking wine until the bottle was empty and my eyes were so swollen I could barely see. The next morning, my head hurt and my face looked terrible in the bathroom mirror. I splashed cold water on my eyes and tried to make myself look normal, but there was no hiding that I had spent half the night crying. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table again, this moment staring at my phone. I needed to talk to someone who would understand someone who knew me before Richard and would still know me after. I called Geeta at 7 in the morning, even though it was Sunday. She answered on the second ring, and I started crying again just hearing her voice. She asked where I was, and I said home, and she said she would be there in 20 minutes. Geeta showed up 17 minutes later with a bag of bagels and cream cheese and her own travel mug of coffee. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug right there in the doorway. We sat at my kitchen table and I told her everything while we ate bagels that I could not really taste. I told her about Alexis showing up and thinking I was the help. I told her about the $8,000 necklace and the Cabo trip. I told her about Richard spending my money on his girlfriend for 6 months while telling her his wife was just some boring woman with a little job. Geeta got angrier as I talked, her face getting red and her hands gripping her coffee mug so hard I thought it might break. She asked if I knew Knox Mercado was Alexis's father. I stopped mid-bite and stared at her because that name was familiar, but I could not place it at first. Then it hit me and I felt sick all over again. Knox worked in our operations department, had been there for 4 years, always quiet and professional. I never knew he had a daughter because we did not talk about personal stuff much at work. Geeta leaned forward and said we needed to be careful about how this affected the company. If Knox found out what happened, if other employees found out, it could create problems we did not need right now. I knew she was right, but part of me wanted to fire Knox just for being related to Alexis. Geeta saw my face and reminded me that Knox did not do anything wrong, that punishing him for his daughter's choices would be unfair and probably illegal. She said we should keep this quiet for now and handle it professionally if it became a work issue later. I agreed, even though it felt wrong that Knox got to keep working at my company while his daughter was sleeping with my husband. I spent the rest of that weekend in my home office going through every financial record I could find. Bank statements, credit cards, loan documents, everything. The more I looked, the worse it got. Richard had been hiding credit card statements in his car. I found them when I went looking for the insurance papers. 3 different cards I did not know about, all maxed out, all in both our names. cash advances totaling almost $30,000 over 2 years. I found a loan application for his medical practice where someone had forged my signature, and the handwriting looked close enough to mine that I had to compare it to real documents to be sure it was not me. Richard had taken out a $75,000 loan using our house as collateral, and I never knew about it. Every page I looked at made me feel more stupid for trusting him. How did I miss this? How did I not notice thousands of dollars disappearing? But I knew how. I was busy running my company, working 60-hour weeks, and I trusted my husband to be honest about money. I trusted him with everything, and he used that trust to rob me blind while sleeping with someone young enough to be his daughter. Monday morning, I was at my desk at 6, making calls before anyone else got to the office. I needed the best divorce lawyer in the city, and everyone said that was Palmer Hendricks. Her firm's website said she specialized in high-net-worth divorces and had a reputation for being tough. I called her office at 8 when they opened and got an assistant who sounded bored. I explained I needed an emergency appointment for a divorce, and the assistant said Palmer was booked solid for the next 3 weeks. I gave my name and mentioned my company name, and the assistant's tone changed completely. She put me on hold, and when she came back, it was Palmer herself on the phone. Palmer's voice was sharp and professional, and she asked what made this an emergency. I told her my husband had been having an affair for 6 months, spending marital assets on his mistress and hiding financial information, including forging my signature on loan documents. Palmer was quiet for maybe 3 seconds and then said she could see me that afternoon at 3. I said I would be there, and she gave me the address of her office downtown in the financial district. Palmer's office was on the 40th floor of a glass tower that reflected the whole city. The lobby had marble floors and modern art on the walls, and a receptionist who looked like she belonged in a fashion magazine. I gave my name, and the receptionist smiled and said Palmer was expecting me. She led me down a hallway with floor-to-ceiling windows and into a corner office that had views of the river and the skyline. Palmer stood up from behind a huge desk made of dark wood and shook my hand. She was maybe 50, with sharp gray eyes and a black suit that probably cost more than my car payment. Her handshake was firm, and she gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs across from her desk. She had a legal pad ready and a pen in her hand, and she looked at me like she could see right through any lies I might tell. I liked her immediately. Palmer asked me to tell her everything from the beginning, and she did not interrupt once while I talked. She just took notes on her legal pad, her pen moving fast across the paper, and her face stayed neutral even when I got to the parts about the money. I pulled out the folder I had brought with all the financial records I had found over the weekend. Credit card statements showing charges at expensive restaurants and jewelry stores, bank statements showing cash advances, the loan application with the forged signature. Palmer went through each page carefully, sometimes making notes, sometimes taking photos with her phone. When she finished, she looked up at me and said Richard's spending of marital money on an affair was called wasting marital assets, and it would help my case a lot in divorce court. She explained that judges did not like it when one spouse used shared money to fund an affair, especially when the amounts were this large. Palmer said we could probably get me a bigger share of everything because Richard had wasted so much of our money on Alexis. I felt something loosen in my chest hearing that, maybe I was not completely powerless in this situation after all. Palmer asked about my company and whether Richard had any ownership in it. I explained I had founded the company 8 years ago before we got married, and I had kept it completely separate. Richard's name was not on any company documents. He had no equity, no ownership stake, nothing. Palmer actually smiled for the first time and said that was very smart of me. She explained that in many divorces, the biggest fights were over business assets. But since I had kept my company separate and started it before marriage, Richard had no claim to it at all. I felt relief wash over me because my company was everything I had built, and the idea of Richard getting any part of it made me want to throw up. Palmer made a note on her legal pad and said we would make sure the divorce papers were very clear that the company was mine alone and Richard had zero rights to it. We talked about Richard's medical practice next, and Palmer's face got serious again. She explained that even though the practice was in Richard's name, any debts he took on during our marriage were probably marital debts. That meant I might be responsible for half of whatever money his practice owed even in a divorce. I felt my stomach drop because I knew his practice was drowning in debt. Over $100,000 easy, maybe more. Palmer saw my face and said we would need to look at all the practice financials to see exactly what we were dealing with. She said there might be ways to argue that Richard's mismanagement of his practice was his own fault and I should not have to pay for it, but it would depend on what the numbers showed. I sat there feeling sick thinking about being stuck with $50,000 or more of Richard's business debts on top of everything else he had done to me. Palmer leaned back in her chair and said we needed to hire someone to go through all our financial records with a fine-tooth comb. She called it a forensic accountant, someone who specialized in finding hidden money and tracking where every dollar went. Palmer said she knew someone excellent who could start right away and would be able to testify in court if we needed them to. The accountant would document exactly how much Richard spent on Alexis, where all the cash advances went, and whether there were any other hidden accounts or debts we did not know about yet. Palmer said it would cost about $5,000, but it would be worth every penny because good documentation would strengthen our case significantly. I agreed immediately because I wanted to know the full truth about what Richard had done with our money. Palmer made a call right there from her desk and set up a meeting with the forensic accountant for later that week. When I left her office an hour later, I felt like I finally had someone on my side who knew how to fight back against what Richard had done to me. Before I left Palmer's office, I asked her about Knox Mercado and whether having Alexis's father working at my company created legal problems for me. Palmer sat down her pen and thought for a moment before saying it was complicated but probably not something anyone could sue me over. She explained that I could not fire Knox just because his daughter slept with my husband. That would be discrimination based on family relationships and could open me up to a wrongful termination lawsuit. Palmer said I should talk to my human resources department right away and make sure we documented everything carefully so nobody could claim I was treating Knox differently because of what Alexis did. I thanked her and left feeling like every part of my life was turning into a legal minefield where one wrong step could blow up in my face. Back at my office the next morning, I scheduled a private meeting with Corey Brandt, our head of human resources. Corey had been with the company for 6 years, and I trusted him to handle sensitive situations without spreading gossip through the building. I closed my office door and explained that I was going through a divorce and there might be workplace complications I needed his advice on. Corey pulled out a notepad and listened without interrupting as I told him my husband had been having an affair with an employee's daughter. I did not use names at first, just laid out the basic situation and asked what I needed to do to protect both myself and the company. Corey's face stayed professional, but I could see sympathy in his eyes as he said, "We needed to be extremely careful about how we handled the employee's status." He explained that we could not punish someone for their family member's actions. That would be discrimination and could result in a lawsuit the company would probably lose. Corey said the best approach was to document everything and treat the employee exactly like we would treat anyone else, addressing only actual performance issues if they came up. I took a breath and told Corey the employee was Knox Mercado in operations. Corey nodded and pulled up Knox's personnel file on his laptop, scrolling through performance reviews and attendance records. After a few minutes, he looked up and said, Knox had been a solid employee for 4 years with no disciplinary issues and consistently good performance ratings. Corey explained that this actually made the situation harder because I could not justify firing Knox or moving him to a different position without a legitimate business reason. If I did anything that looked like retaliation for his daughter's affair with my husband, Knox could sue both me personally and the company. I felt frustrated because part of me wanted Knox gone so I would not have to see him every day and be reminded of what his daughter did. But I understood Corey was right about the legal risks. Corey closed Knox's file and said we should document this conversation and create a plan for how to handle any issues that might come up. He suggested we treat Knox exactly as we would any other employee, evaluating him only on his work performance and behavior at the office. If Knox's performance suffered, or if he created problems because of the situation with Alexis and Richard, we would address those issues through normal human resources channels with everything documented. Corey said we could not preemptively punish Knox for something his adult daughter chose to do, even though I had every right to be angry about the whole situation. I agreed with Corey's approach, even though it felt unsatisfying, and he made notes about our meeting for the human resources file in case we ever needed to prove we handled everything properly. That evening, I was sitting at home going through more financial records when my phone buzzed with a text from Richard. He asked if we could talk because he wanted to explain everything and try to work things out. I stared at the message for a long moment before remembering Palmer's instruction that all communication should go through her office now. I forwarded Richard's text to Palmer without responding to him and let her handle whatever he wanted to say. Palmer texted back 20 minutes later saying she would contact Richard's lawyer and remind him that direct communication with me was not appropriate during divorce proceedings. The forensic accountant Palmer recommended showed up at my house 2 days later carrying a briefcase and wearing glasses that made her look like a librarian. Her name was listed on her business card, but Palmer had warned me she had the personality of a detective and would not stop digging until she found everything. I showed her to Richard's home office and gave her access to all our financial records, bank statements, credit card bills, and tax returns from the past 5 years. She sat up at Richard's desk with her laptop and calculator and got to work while I tried to focus on my own work in another room. 6 hours later, she called me back into the office and showed me what she had found. The accountant had discovered things even I had missed during my own review. Small cash withdrawals that added up to thousands of dollars. Mysterious transfers to accounts I did not know existed. And a pattern of spending that clearly showed Richard had been planning and funding his affair for longer than 6 months. She had spreadsheets color-coded by category showing exactly where every dollar went, and the total amount Richard spent on Alexis was even higher than I thought. Wednesday afternoon, my assistant told me Knox Marquero had requested a meeting through proper channels. I asked Corey to sit in as the human resources representative, and we met in one of the small conference rooms instead of my office. Knox walked in looking uncomfortable in a dress shirt and tie more formal than his usual work clothes. He sat down across from us and thanked me for taking the time to meet with him. Knox said he wanted to address something directly and asked if his daughter's involvement with my husband would affect his position at the company. I could see him gripping the edge of the table and his face was tight with stress as he waited for my answer. I told Knox honestly that what happened between Richard, Alexis, and me was a personal matter separate from his employment. I explained that his job performance was what mattered at this company, and as long as he continued doing good work, his position was secure. Knox's shoulders dropped with visible relief, and he thanked me for being professional about the situation. Then his face changed, and he said Alexis had told him everything about what happened at my house, how she thought I was the help, and said terrible things about me. Knox said he was horrified by his daughter's behavior and ashamed that he raised someone who could treat another person that way. Knox looked down at his hands and said he tried to raise Alexis better than this. That her mother died when she was only 8 years old, and maybe he spoiled her too much trying to make up for losing her mom. He said he gave Alexis everything she asked for because he felt guilty about her growing up without a mother. And now he could see that he created a spoiled young woman who thought she could take whatever she wanted without caring who she hurt. I felt an unexpected flash of sympathy for Knox sitting there talking about his dead wife and his regrets about raising his daughter, but I kept my professional mask in place and told him again that his position at the company was secure, that I appreciated him coming to talk to me directly, and that we should all just focus on moving forward. Knox thanked me one more time and left the conference room, and Corey made notes about the meeting for the human resources file. That night, Richard started calling me from different phone numbers after I blocked his cell. I did not answer any of the calls, but he left voicemails that I listened to later. The messages cycled between apologetic and angry, with Richard begging me to talk to him in one voicemail and then accusing me of overreacting and trying to destroy his life in the next. I saved every voicemail like Palmer told me to and forwarded them all to her email. The next morning, Palmer called and said she was sending Richard's lawyer a formal cease and desist letter telling him to stop contacting me directly. She said if Richard kept calling after receiving the letter, we could use it as evidence of harassment, and it would only make him look worse when we got to court. 2 weeks later, the forensic accountant came back to Palmer's office with her full report, and I sat across from her while she walked me through every single transaction. She had spreadsheets color-coded by category, and the red sections for Alexis' spending covered 3 full pages. $60,000 in 6 months, broken down into dinners at restaurants I had never heard of. Jewelry purchases, designer clothing stores, a weekend trip to Miami, and the $12,000 Cabo Villa Richard prepaid in full. The accountant showed me receipts for $800 dinners where Richard ordered bottles of wine that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. She found charges at luxury hotels in our own city places. Richard told me he was attending medical conferences when really he was spending my money on hotel rooms 20 minutes from our house. The accountant's voice stayed professional and calm while she destroyed my marriage with numbers and dates and credit card statements. Palmer took notes and asked questions about specific transactions, building her case piece by piece. When we finished, Palmer said this level of dissipation would play very well in court. The judges did not look kindly on spouses who spent marital assets on affairs. She filed the divorce papers that afternoon, citing adultery and dissipation of marital assets as grounds. Richard got served at his medical practice 3 days later during business hours. Palmer arranged it that way on purpose, said he deserved the public humiliation after what he did. His receptionist called my cell phone by mistake, thinking I still handled Richard's business matters, and told me a process server showed up during patient hours and handed Richard papers in front of his whole staff. 20 minutes after he got served, Palmer's office phone rang, and her assistant said Richard was on the line screaming. Palmer put him on speaker so I could hear, and his voice came through angry and desperate, yelling about how I was humiliating him publicly and destroying his reputation. Palmer waited until he ran out of breath and then said very calmly that this is what happens when you spend your wife's money on your mistress. Richard tried to argue, but Palmer cut him off and told him all future communication needed to go through his attorney. Then she hung up while he was still talking. I felt nothing listening to him rage, just a kind of tired satisfaction that he was finally facing real consequences. His lawyer contacted Palmer the next week proposing mediation to avoid a messy court battle. Palmer called me at the office and laid out the options. Said we had a very strong case, but litigation would be expensive and emotionally draining. She explained that mediation might get us to a settlement faster and save us both money and legal fees, though she was happy to take Richard apart in court if that is what I wanted. I thought about sitting through a trial, having our whole marriage picked apart in public, listening to Richard's excuses in front of a judge. The idea made me exhausted before it even started. I told Palmer I would try one mediation session, and if it did not work, we would go to court. She said that was smart, that we could always litigate later if Richard was not reasonable. The mediation happened 2 weeks later in a conference room at a neutral office building downtown. Palmer and I arrived first and set up our materials on one side of the long table. Richard showed up 10 minutes late with his lawyer, and when he walked in, I barely recognized him. He had not shaved in days. His suit was wrinkled like he slept in it, and he had dark circles under his eyes that made him look 10 years older. His lawyer was a younger guy who kept glancing nervously at Palmer like he knew he was outmatched. We all sat down, and I looked at Richard across the table and felt nothing but bone-deep exhaustion. This man I had spent 12 years with, worked 2 jobs to support through medical school, built a whole life around, and now he was just a stranger who had stolen from me. The mediator was a woman in her 50s who explained the ground rules and asked us each to share our perspective on the marriage and divorce. Richard went first, and I watched him try to make himself the victim. He said I was always working, that my success made him feel small and inadequate, that he needed someone who made him feel important and masculine. He actually said Alexis made him feel like a man in ways I never did. Like our 12 years together meant nothing because I had the nerve to be successful. The mediator's face stayed neutral, but I saw her eyebrow twitch when Richard blamed me for his affair. His lawyer looked uncomfortable and kept trying to steer Richard toward more reasonable talking points, but Richard was on a roll about how hard it was married to someone more successful than him. When Richard finally stopped talking, the mediator turned to me and asked for my perspective. I did not yell or cry or do any of the things Richard probably expected. I just laid out the facts in the same calm voice I used in business meetings. I told the mediator I supported Richard through medical school, working 2 jobs while he studied. I explained that I founded my company 8 years ago, and it now employs 200 people. I walked through how Richard's medical practice had been losing money for 3 years, and I covered every loss without complaint. I described paying our mortgage, his car payment, our entire lifestyle while he played pretend sugar daddy with my money. I mentioned the $60,000 he spent on his mistress in 6 months, money that came from our joint account that I filled with my salary. The mediator's face said everything about who she believed, and Richard's lawyer started looking through his notes like he was searching for some way to salvage this. Palmer opened her folder and pulled out the forensic accountant's report. She walked the mediator through the findings, every number documented and verified. $60,000 on the affair broken down by category. Another $150,000 in practice losses I covered over 3 years. The house, both cars, our savings, all funded primarily by my income. Richard's lawyer visibly winced when Palmer got to the total amount of marital assets Richard had dissipated or that my income had funded. His face went red and he asked for a 15-minute break to consult with his client. Palmer agreed and they left the conference room while we stayed behind. When they came back, Richard looked defeated in a way I had never seen before. His shoulders slumped and he would not meet my eyes. His lawyer cleared his throat and proposed a settlement. Richard would keep his medical practice and all its debts. I would keep the house and my company. We would split other marital assets 60-40 in my favor as compensation for his dissipation. Palmer did not even blink before she countered. 70-30 split and Richard pays my legal fees, which had reached about $15,000 so far. Richard's lawyer tried to negotiate, said 65-35 was more reasonable. But Palmer just sat there unmoved and said 70-30 plus fees was her only offer. She reminded them we had documentation for everything, and a judge would likely be even less generous to Richard after seeing how he spent marital funds. Richard's lawyer looked at Richard, and Richard just nodded once like he had given up. He knew we would destroy him in court with the evidence we had. Palmer pulled out the settlement agreement she had drafted in advance, confident we would reach this point. She walked through the terms while Richard's lawyer took notes. The settlement included very specific language that Richard had no claim to my company. Not now, and not ever, regardless of any future growth or success. He had to refinance all his practice debts in his name only within 6 months. If he could not get refinancing, he had to sell the practice and use the proceeds to pay me back for the losses I had covered over the years. Palmer had thought of everything. Every possible way Richard might try to come after my money later. His lawyer read through the agreement carefully, and I could see him realizing there was no way out, that we had Richard completely boxed in. Richard signed without reading it himself. Just trusted his lawyer's assessment that this was the best deal he was going to get. Palmer slid the settlement agreement across the table and handed me a pen. I signed my name on every marked line, the pen scratching across the paper with a sound that felt final and strange. Richard signed his pages without reading them again. Just mechanical movements, like he was signing away something he did not care about anymore. The mediator witnessed our signatures and collected the documents, saying she would file them with the court that afternoon. Palmer told me the 60-day waiting period started today and the divorce would be final exactly 2 months from now. Richard stood up when the mediator left the room and moved toward me with his hand reaching out. He said we should talk privately, that there were things he needed to explain, but I grabbed my purse and walked past him without looking at his face. Palmer followed me out, and I heard Richard calling my name behind us, but I kept walking down the hallway to the elevator. The building lobby felt too bright after the dark conference room, and I stood outside on the sidewalk, taking deep breaths of cold air. Palmer squeezed my shoulder and said I did well in there, that the settlement was fair and protected my interest completely. I drove back to the office because going home felt impossible, and I needed to be somewhere that made sense. Gita was in her office when I got back, and she took one look at my face and closed her door. I sat in the chair across from her desk and told her everything about the settlement. The 70-30 split, Richard keeping his failing practice, me keeping the house in company. She said it was a good outcome, that Richard got what he deserved. But then she leaned forward and said, I seemed too calm about everything. She told me I was acting like I just closed a business deal instead of ended my marriage, and she was worried I was holding everything inside. I said I was fine, that I just wanted it over with, but Gita shook her head and said she knew me better than that. I changed the subject to work stuff and she let me, but I could see the concern in her eyes. That night, I went home to the empty house and stood in the kitchen staring at nothing. The settlement papers were in my bag and my wedding ring was still on my finger. And I realized I had been married for 12 years to someone I never really knew. I walked upstairs to our bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and finally let myself cry. Not quiet tears, but loud, ugly sobbing that came from somewhere deep in my chest. I cried for the 25-year-old girl who worked 2 jobs to put her husband through medical school. I cried for every time I covered his practice losses without complaining. I cried for the future I thought we would have, kids and retirement and growing old together. I cried for the person I thought Richard was, the man I married who apparently never existed at all. I cried until my throat hurt and my eyes were swollen and I had no tears left. And then, I lay down on the bed, still wearing my work clothes, and stared at the ceiling until I fell asleep. The next few weeks felt strange and disconnected, like I was living in some in-between place. Technically, I was still married, but Richard was gone and the house was mine alone. I could not make myself care about redecorating or changing anything because it all felt temporary, like I was waiting for something to start. I threw myself into work, getting to the office by 7 and staying until 8 or 9 at night. Gita watched me with worried eyes but did not push. The empty house was easier to handle when I was too tired to think about it. Knox came into my office one Tuesday with quarterly reports, and he was professional and thorough like always. After he left, Corey stopped by and closed my door. He said Knox had been seeing a therapist to deal with guilt about what Alexis did. That Knox blamed himself for raising a daughter who could hurt someone that way. Corey said Knox never mentioned it at work and kept his head down, but the therapy was helping him process everything. I felt surprised respect for Knox that he was taking responsibility for his part even though Alexis was an adult who made her own choices. A few weeks later, Knox caught me in the hallway and asked if he could speak to me for a minute. He said carefully, like he was walking through a minefield, that Alexis had moved back home after Richard could not afford her apartment anymore. He told me his daughter was working with a therapist and deeply regretted what she did, that she wanted to apologize someday if I would be willing to hear it. I looked at Knox's tired face and saw a father who was hurting for his child's mistakes. I did not respond to what he said about Alexis because I was not ready for that conversation, just nodded once and walked away. Knox did not bring it up again. I heard through mutual friends that Richard's medical practice was struggling worse than ever without my money propping it up. Someone told me he was meeting with business brokers about selling the practice, that he might not have a choice if things did not turn around soon. Part of me felt vindicated that the consequences were real and immediate, but mostly I just felt sad that 12 years of marriage ended with him selling the dream I helped him build. That it all came down to money and lies, and a 25-year-old girl who thought she could have someone else's life. 8 weeks after we signed the settlement, Palmer called my cell while I was in a meeting. I stepped out to take it, and she said the court had processed everything and the divorce was final as of that morning. I was officially single again at 37 years old. Palmer said the paperwork would arrive in a few days and I should call if I needed anything else. I thanked her and hung up and stood in the hallway trying to process that it was actually over. 12 years of marriage dissolved in 60 days of waiting. It felt surreal and anticlimactic, like I should feel something bigger than this weird, empty relief. Gita insisted on taking me out to dinner that night to mark the occasion. Though she agreed celebration was not the right word for it. We went to an expensive Italian place downtown and she ordered a bottle of wine. When it arrived, she raised her glass and said, "Here is to new beginnings, to fresh starts, to remembering who you are without someone holding you back." I clinked my glass against hers and tried to feel optimistic about the future instead of just exhausted by the past. The food was good and Gita made me laugh with stories about terrible first dates she had been on. And for a few hours, I almost felt normal. The next week, I made an appointment with a therapist because Gita was right that I was holding everything in. The therapist's office was in a quiet building with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. I sat on her couch and told her the whole story from the beginning. She listened without interrupting and then said something that hit me hard. She told me I had been so invested in the life I built that I ignored obvious red flags about Richard. That I chose to believe his lies because admitting the truth meant admitting I had wasted years on the wrong person. She said recognizing those patterns was the first step to making sure I did not repeat them. That understanding why I made those choices would help me make better ones going forward. I left her office feeling raw and exposed, but also lighter somehow. Like maybe talking about it could actually help me move past it. 3 months passed after the divorce papers arrived, and I settled into a routine that felt more like mine than anything had in years. Knox sent me an email through the proper company channels asking if he could meet with me. Said it was personal, and he understood if I declined. I agreed because Knox had been nothing but professional since everything happened, and I met him in my office on a Thursday afternoon. He walked in looking nervous and apologetic. And then Alexis followed behind him. She looked completely different from the blonde woman who handed me her coat that Saturday. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup, wearing jeans, and a plain sweater that probably came from a regular store instead of some designer boutique. She kept her eyes down and waited for Knox to speak first. He told me Alexis had been working hard on herself, seeing a therapist twice a week, and she wanted to apologize properly if I was willing to hear it. I looked at Alexis and she finally met my eyes, and I saw something real there instead of the entitled attitude from before. I told them to sit down. Alexis took a breath and started talking. Said she knew words could not fix what she did, but she needed to try anyway. She explained that she grew up spoiled after her mom died, that Knox gave her everything to make up for the loss, and she became this person who thought the world existed to serve her wants. She knew Richard was married when they started seeing each other, but she convinced herself it did not matter because his wife was just this abstract idea, not a real person with feelings and a life. Meeting me that day shocked her into realizing she had hurt an actual human being, someone who built a home and a company, and a whole life that she tried to walk into like it was hers for the taking. She said she had been working with her therapist to understand why she made those choices, why she thought she deserved things that belonged to someone else, and she was starting to see how messed up her thinking had been. I listened to her talk and realized somewhere during her apology that I was not angry anymore. The rage that burned so hot when she sat on my couch and insulted me had faded into something tired and heavy, and I was exhausted from carrying it around. I told Alexis I appreciated her coming here and being honest that I could see she was trying to change. I said I forgave her not because she earned it or because what she did was okay, but because I needed to let go of this weight so I could actually move forward. She started crying and thanked me, and Knox looked relieved and grateful in a way that made me glad I agreed to this meeting. They left after a few more minutes, and I sat in my office feeling lighter than I had in months. 6 months after Richard's mistress rang my doorbell, my life looked nothing like I expected and somehow better than I imagined. My company hit record profits that quarter, and we hired 50 new employees, expanded into 2 new markets that I had been planning for years. I started dating someone I met through Gita, a consultant who worked with tech startups and actually got excited when I talked about business strategy instead of looking bored or threatened. He made more money than I did and did not care that I was successful. Treated it like something to celebrate instead of compete with. The house felt full again because I filled it with my own stuff, my own choices, my own life, instead of trying to build something with someone who resented every brick I laid. Some days I was actually grateful that Alexis showed up that Saturday afternoon in her designer dress and her attitude, because she freed me from a marriage that was slowly suffocating who I really was.